Well, hello, everyone. My name is Michel. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm delighted to host Dr. Ray Dorsey, with whom I'm going to discuss preventing Parkinson's disease, an important topic everyone would agree. Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological disorder in the world, and many of us have children and grandchildren. And as scientists keep looking for a cure, it is critical that we also focus on preventing the disease altogether. Dr. Ray Dorsey is a professor of neurology and director of the Center for Human Experimental Therapeutics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. He is working to identify and eliminate the root causes of Parkinson's. He is co-author of the book Ending Parkinson's Disease, in which he, Bas Bloem, Okun and Todd Sherer lay out a plan to help prevent Parkinson's and improve care and treatment. As always, before we start, I would like to remind everyone that this session is for information and education purposes only. So if you are seeking medical advice, please make sure that you consult a medical professional. We may have time for some questions and answers at the end of this interview. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So thank you. Ray, thank you very much for being with us today.
Delighted to be with you, Michelle, and Mark, thank you very much for the invitation.
So I would like to start by asking you a very fundamental question, straight into the action, so to speak. How do environmental factors versus genetic ones, for instance, contribute to the onset of Parkinson's disease? Please.
So there's a great study that's called PD Generation, which is looking at the prevalence of genetic risk factors and genetic causes in people with Parkinson's in North America. And there's another great study called the Rostock study, looking at the same question for North and South America, Europe, and the Middle East. And both these studies, published in Brain this year, have identified that 13 or 14% of people with Parkinson's disease carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. So another way, 86% of individuals do not. The vast majority of people in almost every part of the country, part of the world, have their Parkinson's disease due to environmental factors. We've known this for 100 years. Sir William Gowers, who wrote the Bible of Neurology in the late 1800s, said that only 15% of his patients had a family history of the disease. Dr. Caroline Tanner at the University of California, San Francisco, looked at rates of Parkinson's disease among identical and fraternal twins. If something's really highly genetic, it'll be high levels of concordance agreement in identical twins, much more than fraternal twins. She saw equal rates among both, concluding in 1999 that environmental factors are the principal cause and genetic factors have only a small influence. And so, you're in England, and Parkinson's was first described, the first major description was in 1817 when Dr. James Parkinson, 61 years old, described 6 people with the disease that he said has not been classified in the medical literature. So unlike seizures, unlike stroke, unlike migraines, which have been known for centuries, if not millennia, Parkinson's disease was not described until just 200 years ago. And the span of 200 years, you go from 6 people with the disease that's not been classified in the medical literature to the world's fastest growing brain disease.
Yes.
How does that happen? It can't be genetics, and it's going faster than it can be explained by aging alone. And so I think the principal causes of Parkinson's disease are in our environment. There are chemicals in our food, water, and air. The principal ones are certain pesticides like paraquat, which England has banned, but still exports it to Brazil, Mexico, and the United States. That needs to end. These dry cleaning chemicals, trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, estimate that 1 in 12 workers in the United Kingdom worked with this chemical, trichloroethylene, and as Michelle and I were discussing, including his father, and air pollution, which in 1800 caused the London fog. In 1800, London had air pollution on par with what people in Beijing, China, and Delhi, India breathe in today. What New Yorkers experienced in the summer of 2023 when the skies over the Big Apple turned orange. That was 1800 London. So I think Dr. James Parkin, describing Parkinson's disease, a new disease that had not been classified in the medical literature, describes it in the setting of chronic. He's describing the consequences of chronic high levels of air pollution over years. And I think if you look at the map of the world, areas of the world that are most industrialized have the highest rates of disease. Areas of the world that are least industrialized have the lowest rates of the disease.
Thank you very much. So I have heard you mention several times, including when we spoke recently and in an interview you did for someone else, that you say, how can we cure something if we don't know the causes? And I just wanted to ask your view on our current understanding of the causes of Parkinson's.
What are the causes?
What is our understanding advanced enough, or do we understand it enough to develop
I
the
think
right
so.
cures?
I think the causes are pretty clear in my mind. Now, we might need more evidence to make my colleagues see it in the light. But ask yourself, what evidence would you want to have for determining
Yes.
something causes Parkinson's disease? I'll tell you a story. In the late 1800s, lung cancer was emerging as a increasingly common cause of death in Europe. And then the same thing in the early 1900s. Lung cancer used to be considered a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. It was extraordinarily rare. Almost no one got lung cancer. It was so rare that the medical students and physicians would all gather around when they saw a case thinking it would never happen. They would never see another one. They were unfortunately wrong, because 25 years after cigarettes were introduced, lung cancer started to rise. Lung cancer in the United States peaked. I mean, smoking peaked in the 1970s. And 25 years after the decline in smoking, we see a decline in lung cancer. It was so unusual that the German pathologists looked at the brains looked at their bodies, at the cadavers that they had stored, and they looked to see if there was occult lung cancer, and there was no occult lung cancer, indeed supporting the evidence that this is a new disease. And in the 1950s, a British doctor and a British epidemiologist statistician, Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill, did a unique study. They mailed postcards to British doctors and asked them, do you smoke? And if you smoke, how much do you smoke? And then they sat around and waited for them to die. And then they looked at rates of deaths due to lung cancer among smokers versus non-smokers, and I think found a 30-fold increased risk among smokers compared to non-smokers, and concluded that smoking was associated with lung cancer. But Bradford Hill was, concerned about this. That's an epidemiological study. Maybe smokers are also more likely to drink coffee, and it's really the coffee that's causing the lung cancer. He wanted to know, so how do I go from an association, smoking and lung cancer, to causation, concluding smoking causes lung cancer? And so he set forth 9 different criteria by which you could have this occur. Some of these were that the exposure happens before the disease. You smoke and then you get lung cancer, not the other way around. That there's a strength of association, that the link is strong and not weak. That it's biologically plausible, that smoking has a biological link to it. That there are animal studies that are consistent with it. That there's a dose-response relationship. The more you smoke, the higher your risk of lung cancer. You apply these 9 different criteria to certain pesticides, and you reach that conclusion. Paraquat, this weed killer that kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't, has been associated in numerous epidemiological studies with up to 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Research done this last year by Dr. Kimberly Call and Beata Ritz at University of California, Los Angeles. So it's not just the farmers. Simply living or working near where paraquat is sprayed doubled your risk of Parkinson's disease. Simply working or living near where paraquat is sprayed doubled your risk of Parkinson's disease. It's like secondhand smoke. It's like, you're not the person in the bar smoking the cigarettes, but you're sitting down at the end of the bar and you're breathing in the same chemical and you're getting exposed to it involuntarily. Numerous researchers from around the world have exposed paraquat to laboratory animals, and they developed the clinical features of the disease, including a tremor in some of them, and the pathological features. If you look at their brain, they have loss of dopamine-producing nerve cells. And then The Guardian 2 years ago, Carrie Gilliam and her colleagues documented that the manufacturer of paraquat knew about its toxic effects, linking their pesticide to Parkinson's disease since the 1960s. The industry's own scientists exposed mice, rats, and rabbits to paraquat, and they developed the clinical features of Parkinson's disease, including trouble walking. They did these experiments in the 1960s, before I was born, and 20 to 30 years before academic researchers did the same experiments. So just like the tobacco industry knew about its harmful effects of smoking long before academic scientists did, the same thing, industry scientists, according to The Guardian, knew about its toxic effects, did not seek to withdraw their product from the market, did not seek to introduce a safer alternative, but instead, according to The Guardian, doubled down on their blockbuster product, engaged in a campaign to sell, And I think that campaign has also sowed the seeds of Parkinson's disease for future generations.
It's quite dramatic, but thank you very much for bringing us up to date with that aspect of the condition. So you co-authored the book Ending Parkinson's Disease with Bas Bloem, who we know well, and Michael Okun, who we know extremely well too. We had the pleasure of having them both before you, so you're the third person behind the book finally to be talking to us. And in the book, you outline a PACT or PACT framework to address Parkinson's. So it stands for prevent, advocate, care, and treat. Could you elaborate on the importance of each component and how they interrelate?
Yeah, so the first thing when you get diagnosed with the disease is you should figure out why you got it. First thing you should do if you get diagnosed with the disease is why I got it. And I'm going to give you a few reasons why. One, if you know what causes it, you might be able to treat it and cure it and get rid of it. In the 1700s, I'll give you all of my English stories. So in the 1700s, Percival Potts, a prominent British surgeon, was encountering scrotal cancer among young men in their 30s and 40s. And unless he caught it really early and could excise it, they all died. He tried removing their testes. He tried removing their spermatocord. He tried doing everything he could do in his surgical powers to treat this disease, and he came up short, and they would die. And he's wondering, so why are all these young men coming to me with scrotal cancer? And he took a careful history, a surgeon taking a careful history, and he realized that all these young men had, and when they were young boys, worked as chimney sweeps, were going down the chimneys and cleaning out the chimneys in 18th century London. And they wouldn't bathe very well, or they wore dirty clothes, and they would get the soot would be right next to their scrotum, leading them to develop scrotal cancer years later. Just like smoking, you don't smoke a cigarette and develop lung cancer the next day. It's decades later, and sometimes even after you stop smoking. And just like lung cancer, just like these toxicants and Parkinson's disease, you don't get exposed to a pesticide and develop Parkinson's the next year. Your father didn't get exposed to trichloroethylene and develop Parkinson's disease the next year. It's years of exposure, and then decades later, developing the disease. He did the same thing. England passed a law banning the use of chimney sweeps among young boys, and scrotal cancer disappeared. Today in the United States, you're just as likely to get struck by lightning as you are to get scrotal cancer. It's a non-entity. And I think you can do the exact same thing for Parkinson's disease. You get rid of the underlying environmental causes of disease, certain pesticides, dry cleaning chemicals, and air pollution. You make Parkinson's disease a non-entity. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. We need advocates. We need people to make their voices heard. In this case, it was Percival Potts, but in the vast majority of cases, it's people who are directly affected by the disease. A March of Dimes has nearly eradicated polio from the face of this earth. Some of your listeners are old enough to remember getting polio. Some of your listeners probably have polio. And many of your listeners contribute to a March of Dimes. And now we live in a world where polio is largely non-existent. There aren't even polio specialists. There are no polio treatment centers. The March of Dimes has moved on from polio. It's not even focused on polio anymore. There is a non-entity. We still need to get it in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, but it's largely a non-entity. We've done the same thing for drinking and driving, socially unacceptable. Today, because of Candace Lightner and other mothers, 10,000 fewer American children die in car accidents from drinking and driving than they did in 1980 when her 13-year-old daughter was struck and killed as a pedestrian by a drunk driver. And, HIV is the same thing. We've changed the course of HIV. That's, well within the lifetime of everyone listening. We thought this was going to kill, and it did kill millions. We thought this was going to be an unaddressable plague. And HIV is rapidly disappearing as a major cause of death in the world. The number of new cases of HIV is at its lowest level since 1990, 9 years after it was first reported. It's likely that HIV will disappear as a major clinical entity, knock on wood, in our lifetimes. And we've done that because people found their voice. A March of Dimes, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, ACT UP had a great campaign slogan, silence equals death. And I think for the Parkinson's community, silence has equaled suffering, needless and preventable suffering. And the Parkinson's community adopts the voice that you and Mark have. We will change the course of Parkinson's disease. We'll make it less likely that our children and our grandchildren, our brothers and sisters, our spouses, all develop this disease, and we'll do it not just for all of us, but we'll do it for all generations to come. Third, we need to care for all people affected. It's kind of odd that we generally ask sick patients to come to seek care from generally healthy clinicians. Healthy clinicians should be delivering care to sick patients on their terms. And we should do this for just about for everyone with the disease that wants to receive care. We have the tools and technologies, including video conferencing, that's allowing us to connect to one another across a large pond. We should enable anyone anywhere in the world to receive the care that they need. More people in the world have this than they do refrigerators, and we should be using that as a platform to deliver care to anyone anywhere in the world. And finally, we need better treatments. You know, we've had more therapeutic breakthroughs for Parkinson's disease in the 20th century than we've had in the 21st century. Levodopa, deep brain stimulation are all gifts from the 20th century. No major therapeutic breakthroughs for Parkinson's in the 21st century. Why is that? It means the status quo is not working. We cannot continue to rely on the status quo, the same approaches to developing drugs, to expect us to reach a different conclusion. We know what doesn't work. We need to change to other ways and find out what does work.
I'll get back to telemedicine a bit later because it's an important point. But actually, as you were just talking now about the treatment and saying that there has been no major breakthrough since levodopa, I just wanted to ask you whether we should recategorize Parkinson's disease from a single disease to a broader syndrome, and whether that would help our efforts to find appropriate treatments.
So it's clear that Parkinson's disease, like lung cancer, like breast cancer, has multiple different causes. There are rare, 1% of people have it from purely genetic reasons, Parkin mutations. There are some people who have large genetic contributions from LRRK2 mutations, but the vast majority have it from environmental exposure. Some from working as a printer and getting exposed to trichloroethylene, some farmers from getting exposed to certain pesticides. Some people, like those in 19th century London, from breathing in heavily polluted air, some from some mixture of these. If we pay attention to what the causes are, then we can screen drugs against the likely causes of the disease. I'll give you another example. This is from Australia. And in the 1960s, peptic ulcer disease, bleeding ulcers were a top 15 cause of death. And people would routinely bleed. Now, even when I was in medical training, bleeding ulcers was something you encountered all the time. And your job was to stop the bleeding and transfuse people with blood and try to prevent them from dying. And some Australian physicians came up with this idea that bleeding ulcers had nothing to do with stress and jobs, and it had everything to do with an infection, a bacteria, H. pylori. And they were largely ridiculed and met with considerable skepticism. One said, the only person who believes me is my wife. And one even went to this point of giving himself infection with H. pylori, developing stomach ulcers himself, and then curing himself with antibiotics. Peptic ulcer disease is a non-entity. I mean, it's not quite non-entity, but not even a major contributor to death or disability because it's treatable with antibiotics. How do we know that the treatments for these pesticides and trichloroethylene aren't chemicals that we have? If we start looking at these chemicals and studying them and then screening drugs against them, we might find there are certainly amenable ways to get better treatments. At a minimum, we'll find out there are ways to decrease our exposure to these toxins. You know, if someone gets diagnosed, a smoker gets diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing we tell them to do? Stop smoking. But when I see a farmer with Parkinson's, or neurologist sees a farmer with Parkinson's, what do we tell them to do? We tell them to stop getting exposed to pesticides. We say, are you getting your water from a well? It's just not even asked. Do we tell people who are coming from heavily polluted parts of the country or world to stop getting exposed to air pollution and get an air purifier? Do we tell people to buy organic and wash their fruits and vegetables with water and a pesticide wash? I mean, there are tons of things that we can be doing as individuals in our communities, in our society, to decrease the likelihood of progressing this disease and to lay the path for preventing people from ever getting them and lay the path for better treatments.
Are you saying that the treatment could vary depending on the cause of the condition? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so like just take breast cancer. We know some breast cancer is due to radiation, excess radiation from doctors ordering unnecessary tests, or in some cases too many tests, or sometimes they're just necessary. If you stop doing that, you're going to stop breast cancer. It's likely that some breast cancer is due to endocrine disrupting chemicals. If we decrease our exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, we're going to decrease breast cancer. This is all eminently achievable, and really, it's on us to adopt them.
So in your book, you talk about the importance of early diagnosis. And to be the devil's advocate for a second, because this is not my opinion, but it's an opinion that I hear quite often. So given that there is no cure, why is early diagnosis so important?
Don't you want to slow the progression?
Absolutely.
So Bas Bloem has done great research showing that exercise slows the rate of progression of disease. If you want a disease-modifying therapy, the disease-modifying therapy we're all looking for is right under our noses, and it's called exercise. And Bas Bloem and his colleagues have shown that exercise leads to increased release of growth factors that protect the remaining nerve cells. If I knew at an early age that I had Parkinson's or was likely to develop it, I would be exercising like nobody's business. And so there are lots and lots of things that we could do. If I knew our risk for it, would I avoid pesticides and air pollution even more than I do now? Yes. If I had the means and were living in London, would I think about moving to the less polluted parts of the country? Yes. There are lots and lots of things that we can do if we know what's happening.
So you have been a pioneer in using telemedicine, and you were showing us your phone a few minutes ago. How has this technology impacted patient access and outcomes?
So we've done randomized controlled trials that have showed that, one, it's feasible. Like when we started doing telemedicine in 2007, people said, 70-year-olds with Parkinson's aren't going to be able to figure out how to use video conferencing. I've always said it's much easier to learn how to use video conferencing than it is to drive. And sure enough, the vast majority of people are able to use video conferencing. And we've connected to patients in 20 different countries on 6 continents and 5 states and throughout the US. We had a program in New York State that offered care for free to any New Yorker who had Parkinson's disease. 500 people signed up from Long Island, New York, New York City, all the way to the western part of the state west of me in Buffalo. Over half the people that we cared for lived in health professional shortage areas, where there are very few doctors. Half the people we saw did not have a college education. So we were able to reach the types of people that most people thought we couldn't reach. And we were able to do so because when you bring care to patients instead of patients to care, you open the door to vastly improve care, and you open the door to providing care that's centered on the needs of patients instead of centered on the needs of clinics.
So we had actually the pleasure of interviewing Roberto Cilia, who is an Italian neurologist who has been doing studies, as I think you probably are aware of them, on the use of mucuna in those countries where incomes are low or extremely low, and people either don't have access to levodopa or simply can't afford it. Are you in favor of such an effort? Because actually it is good to be able to connect to you through the phone, but people will still need access to the medicine, I guess.
So our next book, called The Parkinsons Plan, has 3 goals. One is to stop the rise of Parkinson's disease, to have no growth in the incidence of Parkinson's disease by 2035. And if we take actions, we can do that. Second is to increase the amount of funding for Parkinson's disease and the proportion of funding aimed at preventing the disease by 10-fold. And the third is to guarantee that 100% of individuals have access to levodopa. Levodopa is safe, it's inexpensive, it's easy to take, yet large portions of the world do not have access to it. We don't find it acceptable for people with HIV to go without treatment for their HIV. Indeed, the UN-AIDS has a goal that 90% of people who are known to have the disease are treated, and they're likely going to meet that goal in the coming years. If 90% of the world can get HIV antiretroviral therapy for HIV, which is far more expensive, far more complicated, much more complicated to deliver, then we can certainly get 100% of the country, 100% of the world getting access to levodopa. This is just a matter of political will, and we have, as a Parkinson's community and as Parkinson's doctors, someone's on me, have not made our will felt, and we for some reason find it socially acceptable that people with Parkinson's go without this. We don't think that people with seizures should go without anti-seizure medications. We don't find it socially acceptable that people with HIV go without antiretroviral therapy. We should not find it socially acceptable that people with Parkinson's go without safe inexpensive, highly effective treatment.
Fully agree with that. How, in your view, can patients, caregivers, and advocates in general effectively advocate for increased research, access to care, and in particular policy changes to support the Parkinson's community?
Join the PD Avengers, pdavengers.com, formed by Larry Gifford, Sonia Mather, and Tim Haig Jr., 3 Canadians with the disease who formed a global grassroots organization, 8,000 members, 100 different countries, 100 supporting organizations. The status quo is not working. We can't just rely on the established organizations to change the course of Parkinson's. We haven't made the headway that we need to make. We need new voices, and those voices need to be led by, managed by people with the disease.
Fully agree with you. And we're very supportive of PD Avengers, most definitely. What, in your view, are the global challenges in addressing Parkinson's disease? And actually, how can international cooperation potentially accelerate progress? You mentioned UN-AIDS, for instance.
It's just a non-entity. You know, in the United States, people with HIV in the early days were blamed for their own disease. And these HIV activists led by Larry Kramer, David France, Peter, I forgot his name, lots of individuals changed the course. They put a national quilt that covered the National Mall with a patch for each person who had died from the disease. They changed the course of the disease in the absence of a federal response to it. If HIV activists can do that for HIV, why can't Parkinson's activists do the same thing for Parkinson's disease? You know, when I see someone with Parkinson's, I get pissed off. I get pissed off because I think I know what's in store. It's a terrible disease. You know, Michael J. Fox says it sucks. Brian Grant, the NBA basketball player, says it sucks.
Yes.
And I know what's in store, and it stinks. And I think it's entirely preventable and unnecessary. You know, suffering might be part of the human condition, but preventable needless suffering should not be.
Yes. So you were saying earlier that there haven't been a lot of development since levodopa and DBS, but actually, as a specialist of treating the disease, has anything caught your mind in the last years as providing some hope for the future, or things you will be looking at in the next coming years you hope to see developing in the right direction?
So Michael Okun, in our book, The Parkinsons Plan, forthcoming, has 3 horizons. What's in the near term, 0 to the next 5 years, horizon 2, next 5 to 10 years, and long term beyond 10 years. So he's laid that out. You'll bring them back and you can get a copy of the book. To me, and full disclosure, I've done some consulting for the companies that have helped develop these treatments, but I think the levodopa pump, the subcutaneous pump, could be a very big benefit for people. We know how much the insulin pump has changed the course of treatment for diabetes. You know, it used to be that you had to go to the doctor's office to get your blood stick, and then you got your dose, your insulin, based on what the doctor recorded. Then people could record it themselves at home and then inject themselves with the insulin. And now we have insulin pumps and continuous glucometers, which allow dose to be based on what your blood glucose is.
Yes.
So we developed these levodopa pumps, which can just give you a continuous infusion underneath your skin. There's still lots of skin adverse effects associated that need to be addressed. And in the future, could we like put an accelerometer in there and measure your gait speed and then dose your levodopa based on how well you're walking, for example, or the amount of balance or imbalance that you have? I think we need to be thinking a little bit more creatively about these applications, but I think the levodopa pump could be a big benefit for lots of people with the disease.
I fully agree with you. It was approved in the UK and in Europe first, and recently by the FDA. And I have been in touch with some people with Parkinson's in the US who are now scheduled to have it installed on them in the first month of next year. I spoke to someone in Spain who showed me the pump, actually has been using it for a few weeks now with amazing effect. So I fully support that view. I just wanted to ask whether adaptive DBS is something that could be transformational in your view as well.
Yeah, so the guy that asked for that's Michael Okun. And so the nice thing is Michael and I know different things. So Michael's in charge of treatment, I'm in charge of prevention. But yes, I think adaptive DBS is exactly the same type of idea. Can you personalize, customize the settings based on either biological factors in the brain or external factors, again, like walking,
Yes.
balance, and the like.
So you were talking about your new book called The Parkinsons Plan that will be out in August. And actually you were showing us before we started a few pages. I think, would you mind just sharing some of the information with the whole audience?
Yeah,
I'm
so
quite interested in the fact that it touches both on prevention, but also helping people who already have Parkinson's.
So the link is in the chat. This is the commercial portion of it. The more people who pre-order a book, the more attention a book gets from media and the like, and the more attention gets paid to Parkinson's disease. So if you think we should stop the rise of Parkinson's disease, if you think we need to increase funding 10x and increase the portion of funding aimed at preventing the disease 10x, if you think 100% of people with Parkinson's disease should have access to levodopa, buy the book, increase awareness for it. It's there, available. It's $30. I'll even say this: if you pre-order the book and you send me an email at info@endingpd.org, we'll send you a signed copy of this for free. It's a little commercial plug here. If you pre-order the book, just tell me you pre-ordered the book, give me your mailing address, and we'll send you a copy of Ending PD for free. And if you can't afford Ending Parkinson's disease, we'll send you one for free. Just give us your mailing address. No questions asked. And in the book, we provide, people always, at any time I give a talk, they're like, well, what should I do next? And so I got tired of getting asked that question. So we wrote this Parkinson's Plan, and in it we provide, the last chapter lays out a plan for preventing and treating Parkinson's disease. It does by what can we do to prevent, what can we do to learn why people got the disease, your question about treating the underlying causes, what can we do to amplify the voices of those affected, and what can we do for the new treatments. And Michael outlines these 3 horizons of new treatments for Parkinson's. My job was to come up with ways to prevent the disease, and I'll give you a little preview. Can you see this?
Yes, perfectly well.
And so this is the Parkinson's 25. It's part of the book. It's 25 things you can do to reduce your risk of Parkinson's. So if your children, your brothers, your sisters, your spouse don't want to get Parkinson's disease, what can I do in my everyday life to not get Parkinson's? We're giving you 25 things to do. And most people with Parkinson's disease want to know what they can do to slow the rate of progression of the disease. And so we give you 25 things on what to do. And there's like one is exercise. I'm giving you a sneak preview here of this. First time on a podcast, you're getting a sneak preview. And they apply to everyone, regardless of age, sex, or geography. And so number 1 is to wash your produce, even your organic ones. I told you that certain pesticides are likely a major cause of Parkinson's disease. It's important to buy organic. I forgot what the word for organic is in England. What do you guys call it in England?
I think we call it organic, don't we, Mark?
Oh, Bas or something different in the Netherlands. But
okay.
And then even organic produce, at least in the United States, can have unsafe levels of pesticides.
Yes.
Tells you how messed up the food system is. So wash it with water and wash it with either a vegetable wash, salt, or vinegar. Second one is to change your diet. We know that Mediterranean diet is associated with a decreased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. We also know that for people with the disease, it's likely to be beneficial. And I think part of it is because Mediterranean diet is low in animal products, lower in animal products, and animals concentrate these toxins like pesticides as they go up the food chain. So when you're eating an animal, like drinking a glass of milk, or eating a steak, you're not just eating the cow or drinking the cow, but you're drinking what the cow ate and what the cow ate. And some of these toxins, especially the ones that dissolve in fat, concentrate or magnified as they go up the food chain. And the third one listed here is make sure your grocery store is safe and not near a dry cleaner. So there are studies in Germany that show that grocery stores that are simply located near where a dry cleaner is that uses, perchloroethylene, for example, will have this, which is fat soluble and readily volatile. This will be found in the butter and in the cheese in a German grocery store that's located near a dry cleaner. So in the book, we say to make sure that your grocery store is not located near a dry cleaner. And then I think there's one more we can show you. And then enjoying wine without pesticides. you know, we have organic produce. Why don't we have organic wines? Why don't we have organic golf courses? Why aren't these things increasingly common? In the United States, we subsidize agricultural production a lot. If we're going to subsidize agricultural production, how about we subsidize agricultural production that doesn't use nerve toxins?
Thank you very much. In preparing this interview, I had, of course, a look at your website, endingpd.org. You want to say some words about the website and also perhaps the film, The Long Road to Hope, which I thought was quite impressive.
Yeah, so The Long Road to Hope profiles, I think, about a dozen people with Parkinson's disease, including Larry Gifford, the founder of Ending Parkinson's Disease. It discusses the path from our previous book. It highlights what are some of the likely causes of the disease, and it's hopeful. It tells you pretty in an unvarnished way about the stories, good and bad, about the people who are most directly affected by the disease. It's freely available. You can just go on YouTube and watch it. And then our website, also freely available, endingpd.org. You can order our book, our first book. All the authors are giving their proceeds from the first book to efforts to prevent and end Parkinson's disease. Todd Sherer, who we didn't mention, is one of the co-authors. All the monies he's getting are going to the Michael J. Fox Foundation, for example. We had a listening tour. We visited communities in the United States that are been directly affected by it. We met the people with it. Actually, we talked about my first meeting with Larry Gifford. You know, in this age of Zoom, you end up meeting people for years, and then we actually met each other in New York City for the first time. And we met the communities that have been affected by, for example, trichloroethylene, who, you know, people who were breathing in this chemical likely in their high school, because their high school is located next to a manufacturing facility where this chemical contaminated the underlying groundwater. The groundwater migrates and then it can evaporate this chemical like radon into people's schools, homes, and workplaces undetected. So that's what you can see, all of that on our website. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. The first thing they'll do will just ping you. It's free. We have about 7,000 individuals who receive our newsletter. And for example, it highlighted in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency banned trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene last week, and we put out an announcement on that.
That's an amazing progress. As you said, it may take a few years to be fully implemented, but definitely it has to start somewhere. And I was really cheered up by that information. So Ray, thank you very much. I will stop my interview here so we have some more time for looking at the questions from our audience. I'm looking at the Q&A here, and I see Pilar, who basically she says she agrees with you on the chemical link. What do you think of the perfect brewing conditions for PD being a combination of environmental factors, gut lining damage, genetic component, and maybe a virus acting as a trigger and producing an inflammatory reaction?
Yes. So one that I see a question, the ordered book can be pre-ordered anywhere in the world. You just go to the website and you can order on Amazon or wherever you prefer to order it from. So I like to make things simple. But unfortunately, life is complicated. So there are undoubtedly factors that explain why some farmers develop the Parkinson's disease and some farmers don't. And some of that has to do with the dose of exposure, the duration of exposure, the timing of the exposure, the route of the exposure. Were they exposed to their skin? Were they inhaling it? Were they ingesting it? Likely interactions with genetic factors. So there was a great study that just came out from the Michael J. Fox PPMI study that showed that pesticide exposure in those individuals who carried GBA mutation, those people who carried GBA mutation had pesticide exposure were much more likely to develop Parkinson's disease than those who had a GBA mutation and not. So if you have a genetic risk factor for the disease, I would be even more concerned about the environment. And then there are likely other contributing factors. There are people who have Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonian disorders from viruses. So we know from the influenza pandemic in 1918, soon followed with a sleepy sickness, and some individuals developed a Parkinsonian state as depicted in the movie Awakenings. But I think for the vast majority of people, it's due to environmental factors. If you're not exposed to these toxicants, you are highly unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease. I tell people, I don't think I've had, to my knowledge, I don't think I've had substantial exposure to these toxicants in my life to date. And I think I'm really at really low risk for developing Parkinson's disease. And that's, quite comforting. And I think if you we do the things that are really readily addressable, if we, just like we've gotten rid of lead and lead paint and leaded gasoline, and we're all smarter because of it. Lead levels in children today are 90%, more than 90% lower than they were just 2 decades ago. If we get rid of these toxins, we get rid of the disease, just like Dr. Percival Potts. You got rid of kids doing chimney sweeps, and no one's even heard of scrotal cancer. Probably no one even heard about it until I introduced it. And I think the same thing can happen for Parkinson's disease.
Have we looked at some parts of the world where people might blissfully be able to live without pollutants? And have we seen whether those populations were developing Parkinson's, to validate what we're saying here?
Yeah, so the area of the world that has the lowest levels is sub-Saharan Africa, which until recently had really clean air, clean food, clean water. Unfortunately, pesticide use in sub-Saharan Africa has tripled in the last 30 years. 60% of individuals work in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, and the population is overwhelmingly young. And so we are laying the seeds, and many of the pesticides used are dumping from countries. Listen, we should be holding England accountable for dumping paraquat in the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. You know, you dumped your tea with your British tax, and we dumped it into the water. We can't do that with paraquat because we kill off all the fish and all the other life form. But we should hold our countries accountable for dumping unsafe pesticides in different parts of the world. We should adopt universal approaches. If a chemical is not safe for England, it's not safe for the United States, it's not safe for Tanzania. And that's what we should be doing. If you look, people watch the TV series, The Blue Zones, which highlight, you know, areas of the world with a large number of people living to ages 100. And, you know, they talked about social connectiveness. When I see the blue zones, I see clean air, clean food, and clean water. And I see people living healthy lives without medicine. I think this is universal. I don't think the greatest accomplishment of the 20th century was a 30-year gain in life expectancy in nearly every part of the world. I think the greatest accomplishment of the 20th century was a 30-year gain in life expectancy in nearly every part of the world. And the United States, we're giving it back. Life expectancy today is lower in the United States than when I was in medical school, and we spend 50% more in healthcare. If we change our orientation, if we get rid of these chemicals in our food, water, and air, if we enable everyone anywhere, everyone everywhere, have clean air, clean food, and water, we live longer, healthier lives at much lower cost, with much fewer medicines, with much less money being spent on pharmaceuticals, doctors, and hospitals.
So thank you very much for that, Ray. And so Jane is asking, how relevant is your research to MSA as opposed to Parkinson's?
So I'll generalize. How does this apply to other Parkinsonian disorders? So I told you that Parkinson's wasn't described till 1817. MSA was described. Former chairman of my medical school, University of Pennsylvania, Milton Shai, I think in the 1950s. And so PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, not described until 1966 by Canadian neurologist. Dementia with Lewy bodies, not described till 1976 by Kenji Kosaka, a Japanese psychiatrist who asked in 1984, is this a new disease? I think all of these diseases, although we have much less evidence, have their roots in environmental toxicants. It's hard to imagine to me that people with MSA went undiagnosed for millennia by clinicians who were really astute. Did Charcot miss MSA? Did William Gowers miss MSA? Did who's the Canadian? William Osler miss MSA? I just don't think people missed it. I think it was extraordinarily rare. There are extraordinarily rare genetic forms of it, but the vast majority of these diseases, I think, will also likely have their roots in the intoxicants in our food, water, and air.
Thank you very much. Now, this is not a question, this is more a comment. Lisa Simansky works for resolveparkinsons.org, and she basically is saying that they are strongly advocating for patients. So if anyone wants to have a look, resolveparkinsons.org is another advocacy association. So someone here is asking, is telling me that you have been involved, I was not aware of that, in Photopharmics and the light therapy. And so how long does it take, and what have the results been so far?
You got a very knowledgeable group. So we are working with Photopharmics, which has developed a light therapy, basically a a light box that emits huge amounts of bright light into individuals. People with Parkinson's disease have a thinned retina. The back part of their eyes are thinned and perhaps perceive less light. It can lead to impaired circadian function, daylight awareness, which can contribute to depression, anxiety, and other features of Parkinson's disease. So we're studying bright light therapy to see if this will be beneficial. If you, I don't know what the website is. If you, maybe I'll find out what this website is. If you, there's a website. If you live in the United States, in certain states, you're eligible to participate in the study. The nice thing is we bring the study to you. You don't need to travel outside of your state in the United States. If you're eligible for the study, all the visits, 3 visits with a doctor, about 5 visits total, are all done in your home. We mail you the light therapy, either an active light therapy or sham light therapy, and you receive the light therapy for 6 months. It's publicly disclosed that 100 to 300 people have already enrolled in the study, and we're enrolling people today as we speak. If you're interested in participating in it, I'll try to get you that website.
Thank you very much. Now, we have 2 questions here from 2 people who would like you to be a bit more extensive in listing the chemicals that are at the basis of Parkinson's, because we have mentioned TCE, we have mentioned paraquat. Are there other things, other niceties we should be aware of out there? I'm sure there are. You mentioned air pollution, I guess, is another one.
Yes. So I'm going to put one website in there, and if Michelle, if you find out there's a website for the study, that would be great. So certain pesticides. So I think the biggest, baddest ones are paraquat. Probably not a huge issue for England, although you manufacture the chemical, you don't spray it on yourselves. Rotenone is a naturally occurring pesticide widely used to kill fish. Sprinkle in the fish and the fish die and you eat the fish. That's another one. I get worried about a class of pesticide called organochlorine pesticides. DDT is the poster child for it. These pesticides in the lab damage, lead to loss of dopamine producing nerve cells in animals. They're fat soluble, so they can get into the brain. Residues of one of these organochlorines called heptachlor has been found in the brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease. So those are the 3 big classes of pesticides. There are other pesticides, chlorpyrifos, widely used on golf courses, utility poles, fences, on apples, at least in the United States. As another one, it's estimated to have cost 25 million American children 17 million IQ points. So those are some of the pesticides. The chemicals are trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. Now, these are widely, used in dry cleaning, degreasing. They contaminate up to 30% of the groundwater in the United States. They contaminate groundwater in countries on just about every continent on the world. And they evaporate like radon evaporates from soil. These chemicals can evaporate from soil or water and enter people's schools, homes, and workplaces. They've done so for every place from Shanghai, China, to Newport Beach, California. There are probably, and then air pollution from traffic and likely from other sources as well, including wildfires. There are likely others. Those are the 3 big ones. I try to simplify it, for which we have the most evidence. And I think these are ones, large effect sizes, especially for pesticides and trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, or widely applicable air pollution. There are likely other chemicals. PCBs are very similar in their chemical structure to organochlorines. These things are used in the electronics industry. Heavy metals are found in high amounts in people with Parkinson's disease. I think some of those heavy metals are hitchhiking on pieces of dirt and soot in the London fog and making their way back to the brain. There are likely others, but those are the major ones. We discuss a lot of this in far more detail in our second book, where we highlight how chemicals in our food, that's one chapter, chapter 1, water, chapter 2, indoor air, chapter 3, and outdoor air, chapter 4, are contributing it. And we even talk about how Pope John Paul II likely got his Parkinson's disease, for example, from exposure to manganese from mining. So there are a wide range of ways that people can get Parkinson's or related disorders.
So going back to chapter 2, water for a second, I have a question here from Suzanne, who is asking whether we should worry about the water we drink. And obviously, I guess the answer is probably yes, but should we avoid buying water in plastic bottles? Should we drink from the tap? Should we use filters? Is there anything we can do?
So again, I came to this late, like before I had my sabbatical 6 or 7 years ago. I used to think the food I ate, the water I drank, and the air I breathed was safe and clean. I no longer think that. Now I live in the United States, but I suspect that this applies to just about every place. So I make no assumptions. So I buy organic, I wash my fruits and vegetables, I put a carbon filter on my water. So I'm not endorsing any products, but you can get these at the grocery store, Pure and Brita, you know, $30 or $40. I put it on my faucet. You change the filter every 6 months. And these carbon filters are pretty good at getting rid of pesticides and dry cleaning chemicals, and likely other chemicals, even chemicals that are even more recently being identified that may have health consequences. There was been a study looking at plastics being found in artery plaques.
You're reading my mind. It was my next question.
They're finding
microplastics.
Plastics in this, and they found plastics in one study, I think in Science, in animal models reproducing some features of Parkinson's disease. So yes, I worry about chemicals known and unknown that could be causing the disease. It's also worth noting that over time, the safety threshold for many of these chemicals only gets lower. So I like to get ahead of the game and find out and prevent myself from getting exposure. And if I had these disease, just like if I had lung cancer, I would be adamant about like avoiding smoking or secondhand smoke. I would be concerned if I had Parkinson's, you know, what are my neighbors spraying on their yard next to me? And this is all like unnecessary. Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, wasn't against pesticides. She knew that DDT saved millions of people from getting malaria in World War II. What she was against was indiscriminate use of pesticides. To what end? Are we spraying pesticides on our kids' schools so our kids' playgrounds don't have weeds? Is this what we're going to do so our kids get intellectual disabilities and can't increase risk of cancer, increase risk of Parkinson's? We dry clean our clothes so our clothes don't shrink. Are we going to really increase people's risk of Parkinson's and cancer so our clothes don't shrink? If you just like think a little bit about it, you get up to some different conclusions.
You were talking about children, and Tessa is asking whether childhood exposure to PD-causing toxicants is generally worse than adult exposure. I guess intuitively, I would say
Parkinson's disease are planted at an early age. I'll give you an example. So the Marine base Camp Lejeune. Do Europeans know about this Marine base? So
actually, I heard about it, but I'm sure not everyone has. So it would be worthwhile talking about it.
In the United States, we have a lot of military bases, and there's this military base in North Carolina on the Atlantic coast, and it was contaminated with these dry cleaning chemicals, perfluoroethylene and trichloroethylene, likely from a dry cleaner, because the Marines officers need to have their uniforms dry cleaned, and there was inappropriate disposal of these chemicals from a dry cleaner and other sources. And so for 25 years, people were drinking in these chemicals. And Drs. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman and colleagues from University of California, San Francisco showed that Marines who were exposed to these chemicals in their water had a 70% higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to Marines at a base on the West Coast. That was still contaminated, but less so. The Marines, by and large, by definition, almost were healthy when they were exposed, right? You don't become a Marine unless you're really healthy. Marines like the elite level of the military in the United States. They were on average 20 years old. Some were 19, 18. Some were teenagers when they were exposed. And they were only exposed for a short period of time, on average 25 months, 2 years. So you're taking healthy men and women, largely men, at a young age, 20, some 19, 18. And 35 years later, they were increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The NBA basketball player Brian Grant was a 3-year-old boy at the Marine base. Think the Marine base, think like you guys don't have big college campuses, but like think like, I don't know what you would call it in the United Kingdom. I don't know, think like Oxford or something like that, you know, like a big town. And because the Marines had children, and so he was a 3-year-old boy. His father was a Marine there. Brian Grant was drinking in this chemical. His father dies from cancer, esophageal cancer linked to the chemical. And then his younger brother almost dies, likely from a respiratory disease tied to his exposure. And miraculously got better after they left Camp Lejeune. And 30 years later, while still playing in the NBA, Brian Grant realized he can't jump like he once did off his left leg, and that he had a tremor in his left hand. So 30 years, just like the Marines, 30 years afterwards, at age 36, he's diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So I think you get early childhood exposure, spraying of pesticides on in rural areas, and you're bringing it in. I think you're laying the seeds for this. So these preventive measures are really important for your children, for your grandchildren, and we can do this right now. We take actions right now to prevent you from ever developing a disease 50 years from now.
So thank you for this. Tim is actually mentioning that, well, we said that the farmers using paraquat had a double risk of developing Parkinson's, and he was expecting it to be bigger. And he's basically asking whether, for instance, there are not far more people in Vietnam who would suffer from Parkinson's due to Agent Orange than we see. Do we see those numbers dropping as people pass away of all age?
Yeah. So so one, just think about how hard it is to do these studies. So I didn't know about this, but think about it. You need to study exposures that happened years ago, follow those individuals for a sufficient amount of time, not lose anyone to follow up, not have them die from some other disease related to the chemicals. And you have to do it without measuring how much they actually got exposed. You don't have like a biological measure that you can see how much they were exposed. So everything in these studies biases you toward the null, to understating the results that you see. Almost everything biases you. So when you see something, when Dr. Tanner, Dr. Beata Ritz, Dr. Connie Maris, Dr. Allison Willis come out with a study showing an association, you should sit up and pay attention, because it's likely that the risks are understated. Just like at Camp Lejeune, the comparison group was also exposed to the same chemical, which would dampen the difference found between the two groups. So I think the risks are much greater than the actual risks are much greater than the studies actually find. So during Vietnam, the United States sprayed Agent Orange, a weed killer, a defoliating agent, over North Vietnam, nominally so that they could identify the enemy and strike them. It turns out that Agent Orange has been linked to Parkinson's disease. We have a National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Science in the United States have asked for studies to be done. Those studies have either largely not been done, only a few have, or not been published. But in the United States, 10% of people who have Parkinson's are veterans. The U.S. General Colin Powell did 2 tours of duty in Vietnam in 1963. He's dumping a more toxic form of Agent Orange called Agent Purple. The agents were named based on the stripe that was around the barrel that was dumped over Vietnam. And as some of you know, when he died with Parkinson's disease and multiple myeloma, both linked to Agent Orange. Again, the evidence is there, and again, it's different causes for different people at different times in different geographies. You know, I don't think Michelle's father was dumping Agent Purple over Vietnam in the 1960s, but you know, both Michelle's father and General Colin Powell have Parkinson's, likely for entirely different chemical toxins, likely from chemical toxins, though, that have a shared mechanism. They all damage the energy producing parts of cells, and they're all either inhaled or ingested.
Thank you. John Coleman has a few interesting questions. John, we may not be able to answer all of them. I'm going to pick one about stress. He sees patients. I don't know if you're familiar with John Coleman. I bought one of his books when I was just early diagnosed. John basically tells us that over 90% of his patients have a history of either direct trauma or long-term stress or inherited trauma, for instance, parents being involved in war. Have you looked at stress as, I know that stress, according to Bas Bloem, uncovers sometimes an underlying Parkinson's condition, but have you seen stress playing more than just that role, but maybe causing Parkinson's?
So to my knowledge, you put a laboratory mouse in the lab and you let it age, it doesn't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. You put a mouse in the lab and you give it stress, it might become depressed, but it doesn't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. The only way we can get laboratory animals to develop Parkinson's disease, to my knowledge, is we manipulate their genes or we expose them to environmental toxins. Now, so those are the principal causes, but that does not mean that there aren't other important modifiers. So I think there are 3 levels of ways to think about this. There are environmental causes, there are interactions, and then there are modifiers. And so for the exposure, you have to get exposed to these chemicals. What's the dose, duration, timing, and route to that exposure? There are interactions. There are interactions as one of your previous questions with genetics. So we talked about GBA mutations, for example, and pesticides. There are interactions between environmental factors. For example, pesticides and head trauma have a synergistic that amplify the risk of disease. And one of the interactions, as Dr. Per Borkhammer from Denmark has said, is just chance. I think people just get bad luck. I think you're misfolding this alpha-synuclein all the time. And most of the time your body clears it, and sometimes it just gets out of control and you get unlucky. I think the same thing could be playing for a role why some smokers get lung cancer. Only 10% of smokers get lung cancer. Doesn't mean that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer, just means that there are other factors that determine it. And then there are modifiers. And here's the list, the list gets long. Aging is clearly a modifier. As you age, your ability to clear alpha-synuclein decreases, for example. Stress is likely an important modifier. Diabetes and high glucose levels are likely an important modifier of the disease. And so I think there are lots of really important modifiers, and I think these modifiers are addressable. And so some of the Parkinson's 25 talks about, managing your diabetes, preventing your likelihood of getting diabetes, and I think managing stress. I think, for example, Bas probably talked about, people get an intercurrent illness, another illness, they get hospitalized. The compensatory mechanism that have been holding the alpha-synuclein, the Parkinson's disease in check are lost, and the disease becomes manifest, and maybe in an environment where you're more likely to be seen by doctors. So I think there are lots of things. And we know that I think 20% of older adults, at least in industrialized nations, have the misfolded protein. The Lewy bodies are present there, but they don't have the symptoms of the disease. So there are compensatory mechanisms that are holding this at bay, and stress may uncover them in some individuals.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're running out of time. I just would like to ask you two questions. Actually, you mentioned light therapy, but we didn't touch on the topic of red light therapy, photobiomodulation, as it is also known. And I have two questions here from people from the audience who would like to know your views on that.
So I'm not perfectly versed on this. So we know that there are certain wavelengths of light therapy that appear to be more beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease than others. I'm not well versed on the topic, so I'm going to take a pass on that. But I think it's an area of active investigation.
So for our audience, we have on our YouTube channel several video interviews on the topic of red light. The last one was by Symbix. Symbix has one big advantage, is that they are financing medical trials around the world to give us a bit more substance behind the technology. But there is also a couple of Australian companies, an Australian and a Canadian company. So if you look at red light, you will find 3 interesting, if not 4 interesting videos on our channel. And the last question I will keep for myself, you will understand why, Ray. Peter is asking us, is exercise such a good therapy for PD? Yes, it is. And actually, I would invite anyone wanting to learn more about exercise and PD again to look at our YouTube channel. And there's an interview from Bas Bloem in December 22 that tells you all you need to know about exercise and Parkinson's. And I have heard him say again recently that if he was diagnosed, he would be on the treadmill all day long. So Peter, get into your gym gear. It's time to get on the treadmill. Exercise is probably the most potent therapy that we have in our own hands, I believe. I don't know, Ray, if you would agree with that, I guess.
Yes, and I did find the website for our Light PD trial, given there's so much interest in the Light PD. I just put the website, it's lightforpd.com. Again, obviously it's free to participate. I think you even get paid to participate. It's all the visits are done in your home. We send you the light therapy to do it. Anyone with stably treated Parkinson's who doesn't expect their medications to change over 6 months is likely eligible to participate in the study.
Excellent. Ray, I would like to thank you not only for your time today, but for dedicating your career, not only to find cures and help us with treatments, but in particular to focus on prevention, which very few people in your area of medical care do, actually. So you were telling me last time that actually people like Bas, you and Michael Okun had a real responsibility not only to provide plasters to help us along the condition, but to try to basically kill the roots of the problem itself. So thank you so much for having that vision and to also incentivize us to be advocates for this.
Can I give a last thought?
Yes, of course.
So, we're coming in the holiday season, Christmas, the time of gift giving. And I think it's a good time to reflect on the gifts that we've received from previous generations. As we alluded to, we live in a world that's largely free of polio. That's a gift from generations ahead of us, from our parents and from our grandparents. We live in a world where drinking and driving is socially unacceptable. That's a gift from Candace Lightner and other mothers in the 1980s who suffered one of the great tragedies is the loss of a child and didn't want anyone else to experience the same thing. We have the gift of a world where HIV is preventable and treatable, and that was not a foregone conclusion. That was because of advocates like Larry Kramer, who changed the course and dialogue around HIV and are fueling its decline. We have an obligation to receive gifts, and these are gifts that we have obligation to receive, and we have an obligation to reciprocate. And so as we come along to the Christmas season, I think about what are the gifts that we should give future generations. And I think one of the gifts that we should give future generations is a world where Parkinson's is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. And we now are all knowledgeable and all highly educated about how we can get rid of the chemicals in our food, water, and air and give future generations a life that is free of Parkinson's disease, a life that is longer, a life that is healthier, and a life that is free of healthcare expenses that are unnecessary and unneeded.
I'm into that. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Ray. And to our audience, just to remind you, for those of you who didn't hear it at the start of this webinar, our next session will be on the 13th of January, when we'll have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Simon Stott from Cure Parkinson's. He's the head of research. He will be talking to us about research highlights of 2024 and those research highlights of 2025 he's hoping to see materialize. So I wish you all, and Ray, of course, more than anyone else, a very happy Christmas to you and to your family. And I hope to see you all in January. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Ray. Thank you, everyone.